$1 million for a single lead. So how did the biggest police force in Victoria still fail to find him? On the day 2 officers fell in Porepunkah, Australia was pulled into a nightmare that felt all too real. The man who lived alone in that rusted-out bus, Dezi Freeman, didn't vanish by magic, yet the way he escaped sent a chill through anyone following the case. Just minutes after the first shots were fired, he had slipped into the Mount Buffalo bushland as if he had spent his entire life preparing for that moment. While helicopters scoured the sky, detection dogs tracked every possible scent, and hundreds of officers tightened their search grid, all they found was a silence that felt colder by the hour. No footprints, no discarded item, not a single sign of hope. The state waited. The country watched. And then the question that hung heavier than anything else emerged. Sharp, unsettling, infuriating. If $1 million couldn't buy the truth, then what exactly is beyond our reach? The events of 26 August 2025 marked a turning point for policing in Victoria, triggering what would become the most extensive manhunt ever undertaken in the state. In the early hours of that morning, a team of officers approached a rural property on the outskirts of Porepunkah, a quiet community known more for its proximity to the Victorian Alps than for major criminal activity. Their objective was to execute a search warrant connected to allegations involving firearms prohibition orders and offences relating to a minor. The individual named in the warrant was Dezi Freeman, also known legally as Desmond Philby, a man whose reclusive lifestyle had drawn limited attention until that moment. As the officers made their way onto the property, they followed standard procedures, approaching the converted bus that served as Freeman's residence. The structure was positioned at the edge of bushland that led directly into the wider Mount Buffalo National Park. The setting itself was unremarkable from a rural policing perspective. A modest dwelling, a fringe of dense trees, and an environment typical of the Alpine Shire region. Yet, within minutes of contact being initiated, the situation escalated with devastating consequences. 2 officers were fatally shot during the initial interaction, and a third was critically injured. The speed at which the incident unfolded left the attending team with no opportunity to de-escalate or reposition. Emergency medical assistance was deployed immediately, and the site was secured as quickly as conditions allowed. The gravity of the situation became apparent almost instantly. News traveled rapidly through the chain of command, leading to immediate activation of major incident protocols. For the community, the deaths of 2 officers in the line of duty brought a profound sense of shock and grief. For police, it marked the beginning of an operation that would test their resources, processes, and resilience. Freeman fled the property in the moments following the confrontation. The terrain surrounding his residence provided several potential exit routes into the bush. Dense vegetation, uneven ground, and multiple informal paths meant that containment was difficult to establish quickly. Officers who responded to the initial call-out were required to prioritize scene preservation, medical care, and safety, which inevitably delayed the establishment of a fully coordinated perimeter. In the context of bush environments, even brief delays can significantly increase the challenge of locating a moving individual. What followed was a response unprecedented in scale for Victoria Police. Specialist units were deployed from across the state, including search and rescue, the Air Wing, the Special Operations Group, and mounted and canine teams. Additional support was later drawn from the Australian Federal Police and, in certain areas, interstate agencies. Command posts were established in Porepunkah and at key access points surrounding Mount Buffalo. The growing operation involved complex logistics, managing personnel rotations, maintaining communication channels, coordinating aerial and ground searches, and ensuring community safety. Despite the rapid expansion of the manhunt, early progress was limited. No confirmed sightings of Freeman were recorded in the hours immediately following his escape. Searches were hindered by the extensive terrain, inconsistent weather conditions, and the lack of reliable indicators pointing toward a specific direction of travel. The suspect's unique lifestyle added another layer of difficulty. Freeman had spent years living in relative isolation, with limited contact with local residents and minimal dependency on technology. Without phone data, financial transactions, vehicle movements, or digital footprints to follow, investigators were forced to rely on physical evidence and eyewitness accounts, both of which were sparse. Community awareness increased quickly. Roadblocks were set up, and residents were advised to avoid certain areas. The visibility of police activity, helicopters overhead, marked vehicles on rural roads, and search teams stationed near national park entry points became part of daily life in nearby towns. While many residents expressed sympathy and support for the officers involved, uncertainty grew as days passed without significant developments. For those living near the search zone, the idea that an armed suspect remained unlocated within familiar bushland created a persistent sense of unease. Freeman's background became a focal point of public discussion. His history of living alone, his adherence to anti-authority beliefs consistent with elements of the sovereign citizen movement, and his bushcraft skills raised difficult questions about the challenges police were likely to face. Those who knew him described him as private and withdrawn, often choosing to walk long distances through bush tracks that only locals with extensive knowledge would navigate. This profile suggested not only that he was familiar with the terrain, but that he was capable of surviving in it without immediate outside support. The scale of the manhunt reflected both the severity of the initial offense and the operational difficulties of the environment. The search area expanded rapidly, shaped by the assumption that Freeman could have moved quickly and unpredictably. Helicopters conducted grid sweeps. Drones were deployed where terrain allowed. Ground teams tracked possible paths. Yet with no confirmed traces, each new day of searching required a reassessment of priorities. The operation became as much about ruling out possibilities as identifying promising leads. The question that emerged repeatedly, both within the community and in media coverage, was simple yet increasingly difficult to answer. Why had he not been found? In a state with extensive policing resources, advanced technology, and structured emergency response systems, the notion that a single individual could evade capture for so long seemed to challenge assumptions about the limits of law enforcement capability. For many observers, the case became a rare example of how geography, individual skill, and circumstance can converge in ways that complicate even the most coordinated efforts. As the manhunt grew, so too did public interest and speculation. This placed additional pressure on police communication strategies, which had to balance transparency with operational security. Updates emphasized the complexity of the terrain, the risks faced by officers, and the need for patience while the search continued. Yet the absence of confirmed progress fueled broader questions. What specific factors allowed Freeman to remain unlocated? How did his background shape his ability to survive in the bush? And, most importantly, what limitations did the operation encounter in those critical early days? These questions form the basis for the next section of the narrative, which examines Freeman's personal history, his lifestyle prior to the incident, and the characteristics that positioned him uniquely to navigate the challenges of the surrounding environment. To understand how the manhunt evolved into one of the most complex policing operations in Victoria's history, it is necessary to examine the life of the individual at its center. While the incident of 26 August 2025 drew national attention, the factors that shaped Freeman's capacity to evade police for an extended period were rooted in years of living outside mainstream structures. His background, personal beliefs, and daily habits together created conditions that significantly influenced the challenges faced by investigators. Freeman, known legally as Desmond Philby, had resided in the Alpine region for several years before the incident. He lived in a converted bus situated on semi-rural land close to the boundary of Mount Buffalo National Park. The vehicle functioned as both his home and a base for his isolated lifestyle. People familiar with the area occasionally saw him walking on nearby tracks, but regular interaction was uncommon. His presence blended into the landscape, characteristic of individuals who prefer limited contact with others and value privacy above convenience. His choice to live in a makeshift dwelling, without the typical amenities found in most residences, reflected a long-term preference rather than a temporary circumstance. The absence of electricity infrastructure, digital communication, or modern appliances suggested a deliberate retreat from systems most people engage with daily. This lifestyle aligned closely with his ideological stance, which included beliefs associated with the sovereign citizen movement. Individuals aligned with this ideology often reject government authority, question the legitimacy of law enforcement, and challenge the jurisdiction of courts. In previously documented interactions with authorities, Freeman reportedly voiced sentiments consistent with such views, expressing distrust toward institutions and adopting language that positioned himself outside conventional legal frameworks. These beliefs, while not unique in regional or remote contexts, influenced the way Freeman interacted with the world around him. They also shaped his response during police encounters. For someone who perceives state authority as illegitimate, even routine enforcement actions can be interpreted as threats to personal autonomy. Understanding this ideological context does not excuse any alleged conduct, but it helps explain the heightened risks officers confronted when approaching his property on the 26th of August. Freeman's lifestyle also reflected a broader pattern of disengagement. Residents in nearby Porepunkah and surrounding areas reported only sporadic encounters with him. Some recalled brief exchanges in local shops or along rural roads, but most described him as quiet, self-contained, and disinterested in community life. He did not participate in local events, did not appear to maintain close friendships, and rarely sought assistance or services. This low-visibility presence meant that, prior to the incident, few people had formed a detailed impression of him. For police, this limited the availability of community-based intelligence that often assists in early investigative stages. His avoidance of technology further complicated attempts to trace his movements. Many modern investigations rely on digital footprints, mobile phone activity, financial transactions, online communications, and electronic surveillance. Freeman's daily life was largely outside these networks. He did not appear to use banking systems regularly, and there was no indication he carried a mobile device compatible with modern tracking. He obtained supplies infrequently, often purchasing only basic items that did not create predictable patterns over time. This absence of digital or transactional markers significantly reduced the investigative pathways available to police once the manhunt began. Freeman's daily routines prior to the incident emphasized self-sufficiency. People who observed him noted his habit of walking long distances and spending extended periods in the bush. This was not unusual behavior for residents of the Alpine region, but the consistency and duration of his movements suggested a level of comfort with the landscape that exceeded casual familiarity. Over years of repeated exposure, individuals can develop detailed mental maps of creeks, contours, vegetation, and seasonal changes. Such knowledge allows them to move confidently through areas that others might find confusing or hazardous. In Freeman's case, this familiarity became particularly significant once the search moved into remote terrain. His reliance on the natural environment for daily living also played a role. Those who live semi-off-grid often develop habits that reduce their dependency on shops, infrastructure, or external support. They learn to recognize reliable water sources, understand how weather patterns shift through valleys and elevations, and judge how far they can travel without equipment. These skills, combined with the absence of strong social ties, can make individuals difficult to locate when they move unexpectedly or deliberately avoid contact. Despite his isolation, Freeman was not entirely unknown to authorities. Prior to the incident, he had appeared in court on matters unrelated to violence, where he expressed views that challenged the legitimacy of the legal process. His conduct led to concerns about his willingness to cooperate with official instructions. However, there was no record of behavior suggesting he would immediately resort to lethal force. This background contributed to the risk assessment conducted by attending officers on the 26th of August, shaping expectations about how he might respond to a search warrant. The rapid escalation that occurred on the day was inconsistent with earlier patterns, which made the event both unexpected and deeply consequential. The combination of isolation, ideology, and lifestyle choices created a profile that is relatively rare but not without precedent in rural Australia. Communities across regional Victoria, New South Wales, and Queensland have long included individuals who prefer distance from formal systems, choose to live independently, and hold views critical of government authority. Most do not engage in violence. However, when an incident does occur, the convergence of these factors can complicate both initial enforcement actions and subsequent investigative processes. In assessing Freeman's ability to evade capture, it is important to recognize how his lifestyle before the incident aligned with the conditions present during the search. He was accustomed to moving quietly, traveling light, and operating without reliance on tools or resources that leave detectable traces. He understood the terrain intimately, having walked through it for years without drawing attention. He had no pattern of travel that could be mapped or anticipated. These traits were not developed for the purpose of evasion, but became decisive advantages once the manhunt began. At the same time, his minimal presence within the local community meant there were few people who could provide detailed information about his habits, routines, or likely behavior under stress. Investigators attempting to build a behavioral profile were therefore required to rely heavily on limited interactions and previous court appearances. Without strong community insight, predictive modeling becomes more challenging, particularly when dealing with someone who has consistently kept his personal life private. The interplay between Freeman's background and the circumstances of the incident highlights the complexity of the case. It also frames the central challenge that police faced in the days that followed, locating a suspect who had shaped his entire lifestyle around avoiding systems designed to track, record, or monitor individuals. His self-sufficiency, combined with ideological resistance to authority, positioned him uniquely to operate outside the structures that typically guide investigative efforts. These characteristics form an essential foundation for understanding the next phase of the narrative, which examines the first moments of confrontation and how those seconds define the direction of the entire operation. The transition from planned enforcement to critical incident occurred quickly, and analyzing that shift is key to understanding how the manhunt unfolded. The transition from a planned enforcement action to a critical incident occurred with extraordinary speed. While investigators have continued to examine the precise sequence of events, the broad outline is clear. Within roughly 5 seconds of contact being initiated at Freeman's converted bus, the situation escalated beyond anything the attending officers could have reasonably anticipated. These moments shaped the direction of the entire manhunt, influencing every operational decision that followed. As outlined in the previous section, the officers arrived at the property to execute a search warrant connected to firearms prohibition matters and allegations relating to a minor. Their approach reflected standard policing practice for rural environments. The team moved with caution, maintaining visibility of each other and announcing their presence. The dwelling itself posed inherent challenges. A converted bus with narrow entry points, limited external visibility, and an interior layout unknown to police required officers to work in close proximity during the initial approach. The officers positioned themselves near the front section of the structure, attempting to initiate verbal communication. It was at this point, during what would normally be the first stage of engagement, that the situation changed abruptly. According to official briefings and subsequent reports, Freeman discharged a firearm with no observable warning. The officers were placed in immediate danger before any negotiation or tactical adjustment could occur. The confined angle of approach, combined with the limited vantage points available around the bus, meant the team had few options for cover. The impact on the attending officers was immediate and devastating. 2 members of the team were fatally struck in that first exchange, while a third suffered a critical injury. The remaining officers were forced to react within seconds, prioritizing the safety of their colleagues and themselves. Their withdrawal was not a tactical choice, but a necessity, shaped by the sudden loss of control and the need to summon urgent medical assistance. These decisions were consistent with established critical incident protocols, reflecting the priority placed on preserving life once a situation escalates beyond the scope of the initial plan. The abrupt withdrawal created an unintended operational consequence, a brief but significant window of time in which Freeman was able to leave the property before containment could be established. The rural nature of the location, situated at the fringe of dense bushland, meant that escape routes were not limited to roads or open paddocks. Instead, the terrain offered multiple avenues into the surrounding woodland, with steep gradients, low ground cover, and informal trails that could be followed or abandoned as needed. Based on the timeline reconstructed from radio communications and scene assessments, Freeman is believed to have left the immediate area within minutes of the confrontation. The exact route he took remains unknown. What is clear, however, is that by the time additional police units arrived and the perimeter was being formed, he had already gained a lead that would prove difficult to close. In bush environments, especially those characterized by complex gullies and thick vegetation, even a short head start can expand into a much wider search area within a very limited time frame. The 5 seconds in which the confrontation took place continue to be analyzed for training and procedural purposes. It is important to stress that this analysis does not imply fault or misjudgment by any officer involved. The circumstances they encountered were shaped by the structure of the dwelling, the unknown internal environment, and the lack of indicators suggesting an imminent use of force. Officers approaching rural or makeshift homes often face unpredictable conditions, and the nature of such environments can significantly restrict available tactical options. In evaluating these moments, investigators have been careful to avoid speculation about alternative outcomes. Instead, they have focused on how the design of the property and the characteristics of the surrounding bushland influenced the officers' options. The converted bus provided Freeman with a position of concealment and a degree of control over the initial engagement. Police, by contrast, had to approach from exposed ground and had no clear understanding of what lay inside. These factors created a scenario in which the balance of advantage shifted instantly. Once Freeman left the property, the operation entered a new phase that differed significantly from conventional searches. Officers who were trained for remote area work began to assess possible escape routes based on terrain, known walking tracks, and historical patterns of movement for individuals familiar with the region. However, any early advantage that might have been gained was diminished by the urgency of managing the immediate aftermath of the incident, including medical evacuations, securing the scene, and establishing a coordinated command structure. Throughout the early hours of the search, no confirmed signs of Freeman's direction of travel were located. Ground teams examined areas of disturbed foliage, potential footprints, and soft soil around the property's perimeter, but the evidence was either inconclusive or too limited to support immediate pursuit. Weather conditions further complicated the effort. Light wind and uneven sunlight across the gully systems interfered with aerial detection, while the dense forest canopy concealed movement beneath. The rapid transition from a controlled warrant execution to a full-scale manhunt left police responding to conditions rather than directing them. As more resources arrived, the perimeter expanded, but each additional hour made it more likely that Freeman had moved beyond the immediate search zone. Within a short period, the focus shifted from expecting a quick apprehension to planning for a long-term operation involving logistical coordination across multiple agencies. These early minutes of the manhunt demonstrated the inherent difficulty of operating in bush environments where visibility is limited and escape routes are not easily contained. They also highlighted how a sudden escalation can alter the trajectory of an entire investigation. What happened in those 5 seconds did more than define the emotional and operational tone of the case. It shaped the practical realities that police would confront for months. Freeman's ability to move quickly, combined with his familiarity with the landscape and his established routines of solitude, created conditions that made immediate recapture unlikely. With the confrontation concluded and the suspect having disappeared into terrain that strongly favored his capabilities, the search effort shifted into its next stage, a stage defined as much by geography as by strategy. Understanding how that environment shaped police operations is essential to understanding why the manhunt unfolded the way it did, which forms the basis of the next section. The Mount Buffalo region is one of Victoria's most recognizable natural landscapes, but behind its beauty lies a set of environmental conditions that significantly shape the direction of the manhunt. After the confrontation at Freeman's property, the terrain surrounding Porepunkah became the central factor influencing every operational decision. For investigators, it represented an unpredictable, expansive, and physically demanding search environment. For Freeman, who had lived along its edges for years, it offered immediate cover, multiple escape routes, and a level of concealment that was inherently difficult for police to overcome. Mount Buffalo National Park spans more than 30,000 hectares of mixed alpine plains, steep cliffs, boulder fields, and dense eucalypt forest. The foothills around Porepunkah rise sharply into a network of gullies and ridgelines that create natural blind spots. Visibility shifts dramatically depending on elevation, vegetation, and time of day. A person moving even a short distance off a recognized path can disappear from sight within moments. These features formed the backdrop into which Freeman fled, and they became central to the operational challenges that followed. One of the most significant geographical features influencing the search is the network of deep ravines carved through the region over thousands of years. These gullies can be narrow, shaded, and acoustically insulated, meaning sound does not carry predictably. Ground teams noted that voices, footsteps, and even equipment noise could dissipate quickly inside these formations, making it difficult to detect movement nearby. For a person familiar with how sound travels through the bush, such areas offer safe passage where detection is unlikely. In addition to ravines, the park contains numerous granite formations that serve as natural shelters. These include shallow caves, overhangs, and crevices that offer protection from weather and visual concealment. Granite absorbs and disperses heat in ways that complicate thermal imaging, one of the tools deployed by police during the early stages of the manhunt. When a person shelters beneath or behind large granite structures, their body heat can blend with the rock's varying temperature, reducing the contrast required for thermal cameras to identify heat signatures from helicopters or drones. This limitation is well documented in alpine search operations and became a significant consideration as police attempted to track potential hiding locations. Dense forest cover presented another major challenge. The Mount Buffalo Plateau and its surrounding slopes are lined with snow gums, alpine ash, and thick understory vegetation. Even in winter, when some foliage thins, the remaining canopy creates shadows that obscure movement. At ground level, fallen branches, uneven soil, and thick bracken make it difficult to detect footprints or signs of recent activity. Experienced bushwalkers and local residents know that tracks can vanish after only a short period if the ground is dry, and heavy rain can erase impressions within hours. These factors meant that even trained search teams could move through an area without identifying clear traces of a person passing through. Weather further narrowed the effectiveness of traditional search methods. The alpine region is known for rapid and unpredictable changes in conditions. Fog can settle across valleys with little warning, reducing aerial visibility to near zero. Snow and sleet create noise underfoot and alter the shape of terrain features, making it harder for ground searchers to assess their surroundings. Strong winds disrupt helicopter flight patterns, forcing pilots to adjust routes or limit flight time over certain areas. These fluctuations occurred repeatedly during the operation, affecting not only the efficiency of searches, but also their safety. The climate also influenced scent tracking capabilities. Search dogs, although a valuable asset in many rural operations, face significant limitations in alpine environments. Cold air slows scent dispersion, and when wind channels through gullies, it can carry scent unpredictably. Moisture, whether from snow or rain, can dilute scent trails, and prolonged low temperatures may suppress them entirely. These conditions meant that canine units could identify general areas of interest, but struggled to establish clear directional patterns that might lead directly to the suspect. Beyond the environmental conditions, Mount Buffalo contains an intricate network of hidden or informal paths. Many of these tracks do not appear on official maps and are known primarily to locals, long-term residents, and individuals who regularly explore bushland. These paths form through animal movement, erosion, or occasional use by hikers and hunters. To an untrained eye, they appear insignificant, but to someone accustomed to moving through the region, they can function as effective routes. If Freeman relied on these hidden paths, he could have moved quickly and quietly between valleys or towards higher ground without crossing areas monitored by police. The presence of water sources also shaped possible movement. Creeks, springs, and runoff channels provide essential hydration points that do not require a person to enter open areas or approach structures. Moving along watercourses is a common strategy among individuals with bushcraft experience, as it reduces tracks on dry ground and helps mask sound. The Alpine Shire region has multiple such waterways, some of which remain active even in winter. These routes may have given Freeman the ability to maintain mobility while avoiding areas most heavily searched by police. Nightfall added another layer of complexity. In remote bushland, darkness is often total, with little ambient light beyond moon phases. For search teams, safe movement at night requires torches, infrared equipment, and coordinated communication. These tools, essential for safety, also reveal the presence of searchers through sound and light. A single individual accustomed to moving in darkness, relying on touch and terrain memory, can cover distance with minimal detection. A large team, by contrast, must prioritize risk management protocols that naturally reduce speed. Freeman's familiarity with the region's broader topography likely extended beyond the immediate surroundings of his property. Residents had reported seeing him walking alone in areas several kilometers from the bus. Over time, such movement builds a comprehensive understanding of terrain, allowing a person to choose paths that minimize exposure. This knowledge contrasts sharply with the experience of officers assigned to unfamiliar sections of the park. Even highly trained personnel require time to acclimate to new landscapes, particularly those with complex elevation changes and limited visibility. In rural policing contexts, control of territory is often achieved through roadblocks, aerial oversight, and rapid deployment of multiple units. In the Mount Buffalo region, the landscape resisted such control. Only a handful of access roads enter the national park, and many bush tracks are unsuitable for vehicles. This meant that, despite the huge number of personnel involved, police could not physically cover every route or vantage point. As a result, the suspect had several realistic avenues for maintaining distance, even while remaining within a relatively contained geographic area. Taken together, these environmental factors reveal why the manhunt became such an extensive undertaking. The terrain offered Freeman what amounted to a set of natural defensive structures: deep ravines that hid sound, granite shelters that interfered with thermal detection, dense vegetation that broke visual contact, and informal tracks known only to those with long-term local knowledge. In contrast, police were required to operate in full view, under strict safety guidelines, and across a landscape that provided no reliable predictability. This imbalance between a single individual's familiarity with the bush and the operational constraints placed upon search teams forms the foundation for understanding the next stage of the operation: the structure, challenges, and internal pressures of the manhunt itself. While the terrain shaped the search perimeter, it was the organization and execution of the police response that would determine how that perimeter evolved over time. The scale of the manhunt that followed the incident in Porepunkah was unprecedented for Victoria Police, yet the operation was shaped from the outset by a series of limitations that affected both its pace and direction. These limitations were not the result of a lack of effort or commitment, but the product of the conditions confronting officers in the immediate aftermath and the environment in which they were required to operate. The first and most impactful constraint was the disruption caused by the critical injuries and fatalities sustained during the initial confrontation. When officers were shot within seconds of engaging with the suspect, the priority shifted immediately to securing the scene, providing emergency medical attention, and coordinating rapid evacuation. This response was necessary and consistent with critical incident protocols, but it meant that resources which might otherwise have been directed toward containment were diverted. As a result, a crucial window of time elapsed before a structured perimeter could be established around the property. The absence of early containment had significant operational consequences. Once Freeman entered the bushland behind his residence, the opportunity to track him closely diminished within minutes. Unlike urban environments with controlled access points, rural and alpine landscapes offer multiple unmarked routes. Without immediate directional information, police were forced to begin the search with limited clarity. This lack of early orientation meant that decisions in the first 12 to 24 hours were shaped by probability rather than confirmed intelligence. Compounding this issue was the scarcity of information available in the immediate aftermath. Freeman did not carry a mobile phone, had no digital footprint, and did not engage in predictable financial or social activity. Contact with neighbors was minimal, meaning investigators had few behavioral indicators to draw from. Without clear guidance on his likely direction of travel, the search area expanded rapidly. Each additional kilometer of terrain added to the perimeter required personnel, equipment, and coordinated coverage, stretching resources even while more units arrived. As the operation progressed, police relied heavily on aerial assets, helicopters, drones, and thermal imaging, to compensate for the difficulty of ground searches. These tools are vital in many rural operations, but the geography of Mount Buffalo limited their effectiveness. Thick canopy, uneven heat signatures from granite formations, and shifting weather patterns interfered with thermal detection. Fog and high winds restricted helicopter access to certain valleys, while dense tree cover obscured aerial visibility even during clear conditions. Although aerial units provided valuable oversight, they could not offer the consistent, detailed tracking needed to close the distance on a suspect who moved irregularly. Ground units faced their own constraints. The presence of multiple specialist teams, from Victoria Police, the Australian Federal Police, and interstate agencies, meant that coordination was essential. Each group brought its own operational procedures, communication systems, and search methods. While joint commands are designed to manage these differences, the rapid mobilization required in this case left little time to streamline communication flows. Minor gaps or delays in information sharing, which might be manageable in smaller operations, became more pronounced in an effort spread across tens of square kilometers. Another significant challenge was the difficulty of establishing a sealed perimeter around such a large and complex environment. Mount Buffalo and the surrounding foothills contain numerous informal tracks accessible only by foot. These routes cannot be blocked in the way road access points can. Even with more than 100 officers deployed across the region, the sheer scale of the terrain made it impossible to cover every potential exit. A single individual moving quietly on foot could bypass monitoring efforts simply by choosing areas that were unsafe or impractical for teams to reach quickly. Efforts to tighten the perimeter were further complicated by the need to ensure officer safety. After the initial confrontation, the risk assessment remained high. Ground teams were required to maintain spacing, visibility, and regular communication. These safety protocols, essential for preventing further harm, naturally slowed movement and limited the ability to conduct rapid sweeps through difficult ground. In contrast, Freeman, moving alone and without equipment that produced noise or light, was able to travel faster and with fewer restrictions. The expansion of the search area also placed pressure on logistical planning. Rotations had to be managed carefully to avoid fatigue. Equipment needed ongoing maintenance in cold and wet conditions. Aerial deployments required clear weather windows and had to be prioritized for areas with the highest potential value. These logistical demands consumed time and resources that might otherwise have been directed toward narrowing the search. Public engagement added an additional layer of complexity. While community involvement is vital in large operations, the influx of more than 1,100 public reports created an information management burden that required significant staffing to process. Each tip, regardless of reliability, had to be logged, assessed, and in many cases, followed up. This diverted personnel from field deployment, contributing to delays in adapting the operational footprint. Taken together, these limitations do not suggest a lack of commitment or capability within Victoria Police. Rather, they illustrate the realities of conducting a large-scale bush search under conditions shaped by geography, weather, and the immediate aftermath of a traumatic critical incident. The combination of disrupted early response, limited information, environmental constraints, and the need to coordinate across multiple units created a situation in which progress was slow, despite the efforts of hundreds of officers. These challenges set the stage for one of the most difficult phases of the manhunt: the surge of public reports, the rise of speculation, and the operational burden created by widespread community uncertainty. How this information crisis unfolded and how it affected the direction of the search is the focus of the next section. As the manhunt entered its second and third weeks, the operational challenges confronting police were no longer shaped solely by terrain, weather, or the suspect's familiarity with the bush. A new difficulty emerged, one that is common in high-profile investigations, but rarely on this scale. The public, responding to widespread media coverage and increasing anxiety, began submitting large amounts of information to authorities. In total, more than 1,100 reports were lodged. While public assistance is a critical asset in any major search, the sheer volume of material quickly created an information management burden that affected the direction of the operation. The first factor shaping this surge was community concern. The deaths of 2 police officers had shocked the region, and the fact that the suspect remained unlocated intensified local fears. Residents who were normally accustomed to the rhythms of rural life, quiet roads, predictable movements, and familiar faces, began interpreting unfamiliar sounds or sightings with heightened sensitivity. In such circumstances, it is natural for people to report anything that seems out of place, even if it is ultimately unrelated to the investigation. However, the range of information varied dramatically. Some reports were detailed, describing specific locations, times, and perceived behavior. Others were broad and speculative, based on impressions rather than direct observation. Many reflected normal bush activity: hikers moving through trails, wildlife disturbing vegetation, or neighbors traveling at unusual hours. Each report, regardless of accuracy, required assessment, because the consequences of overlooking a credible lead were significant. The pressure created by this volume of information became evident in the daily operations of the manhunt. Intelligence officers were assigned exclusively to triage incoming reports. They categorized tips based on credibility, proximity to the primary search zone, and consistency with known behavioral patterns. Yet even with a structured triage system, the sheer quantity meant that some reports could not be processed immediately. Delays, even brief ones, added further difficulty, as the usefulness of time-sensitive information declined rapidly. A substantial number of reports lacked verifiable detail. Some were based on distant sightings of a person walking along a ridge or moving through tree cover, but without clear identifying features. Others came from individuals who had heard second-hand accounts or who referenced social media posts that could not be corroborated. When investigated, many of the reported locations showed no signs of recent human presence. This is not unusual in large bush searches, but the frequency of such outcomes strained operational momentum. The cumulative effect of unreliable or unverifiable information was a sense that police were chasing shadows. Officers were redeployed repeatedly to investigate new claims, some of which required significant travel time to reach remote parts of the Alpine region. Every diversion meant fewer personnel available for methodical searches in areas that had been prioritized through environmental modeling. Helicopters and drones were sometimes redirected to check reported sightings, only to return without identifying anything consistent with the suspect. For an operation of this scale, resource allocation is critical. Decisions must balance the need to investigate credible leads with the need to maintain a cohesive search strategy. The rapid influx of tips disrupted this balance. Ground teams worked extended hours to respond to new information while still covering designated zones. The overall search grid became harder to manage as unconfirmed sightings continued to expand the perceived area of interest. This environment inadvertently benefited the suspect. Whether Freeman was actively monitoring police movements or simply continuing to move unpredictably, the lack of reliable intelligence created opportunities for him to remain undetected. Search operations rely heavily on pattern recognition, movements that can be anticipated or narrowed over time. When reports are inconsistent or contradictory, patterns become difficult to establish. Police were forced to widen their search instead of narrowing it, allowing a single individual greater room to maneuver. A significant challenge was distinguishing between human activity and the natural characteristics of the alpine landscape. Shadows cast by trees, movement of wildlife, and changes in light caused by fog or cloud cover frequently produced false positives in both aerial and ground-based observations. In a tense environment where officers were aware of the dangers associated with confronting an armed suspect, ambiguity increased the need for caution. This contributed further to delays, as teams often required time to verify what they were seeing or hearing. The media environment also played a role. Coverage of the manhunt was extensive, and each public update, whether from police or journalists, prompted additional community engagement. Some individuals reported sightings after hearing rumors, while others submitted information in response to televised images that sparked recognition or concern. Although this level of public interest is common during high-profile incidents, it can produce a feedback loop in which speculation drives further speculation, creating a large volume of tips with diminishing evidentiary value. Despite the challenges, police continued to treat every report seriously. Officers conducting follow-ups remained aware that even unlikely information can, on rare occasions, produce breakthroughs. This professionalism was necessary but taxing. The emotional weight of the incident, combined with the physical demands of the search area, made it essential to balance operational speed with safety and procedural integrity. Processing more than 1,100 reports while conducting continuous field operations tested those limits. In the broader context of the manhunt, the information surge highlighted a fundamental tension. Public assistance is vital, but unfiltered information can overwhelm investigative systems. Effective communication strategies became essential. Police sought to guide the public on what constituted a helpful report: direct observation, specific timing, and clear location details, while discouraging speculation or reliance on hearsay. This transparency helped reduce some of the noise, but did not eliminate the backlog already created. In hindsight, the surge of public reports illustrated how quickly a major investigation can become burdened when information exceeds processing capacity. It also underscored the importance of establishing robust filtering mechanisms early in an operation, particularly one that attracts widespread public concern. The challenge for police was not a lack of willingness, but the need to prioritize finite resources in an environment defined by uncertainty. These information pressures shaped the subsequent phase of the operation, influencing how police interpreted movement, assessed risk, and planned ongoing searches. They also created conditions that aligned closely with the suspect's capabilities, making prolonged evasion more plausible. Understanding how Freeman utilized his knowledge of the bush and how his survival skills interacted with the evolving search environment forms the basis of the next section. Understanding how Freeman remained unlocated for such an extended period requires a detailed examination of the skills, habits, and environmental knowledge he developed long before the manhunt began. His ability to sustain himself in the Mount Buffalo region was not the product of sudden improvisation. Rather, it was the continuation of a lifestyle shaped by years of living on the margins of the bush, where independence and self-reliance were central to his daily routine. These characteristics, combined with the natural features of the environment, created conditions that allowed him to operate with a level of efficiency that proved difficult for search teams to match. One of the most significant elements contributing to his survival was his familiarity with natural food and water sources. Individuals who spend long periods in the bush often develop a working understanding of how to find water even during drier periods or in winter when streams can be partially frozen or obscured by vegetation. The Mount Buffalo region contains multiple creeks, springs, and runoff channels that remain active throughout the colder months. Knowledge of these locations allows a person to access clean water without needing to approach populated areas or rely on artificial storage. Food availability in the alpine region is limited but not absent. Edible fungi, certain roots, and seasonal plant growth can sustain an individual who understands the differences between safe and unsafe species. Long-term bush residents often develop a mental catalogue of where particular plants grow and how their appearance changes throughout the year. Small sources of protein, obtained without creating visible disturbance, can supplement this diet. While it is impossible to confirm the exact foods Freeman may have consumed, the environment contains enough natural resources for someone with experience to maintain basic nutritional needs. This level of self-sufficiency reduces the pressure to move into monitored areas and makes prolonged concealment more achievable. Shelter was another critical factor in his survival. The Mount Buffalo Plateau is marked by granite formations that create natural overhangs, shallow caves, and crevices. These structures offer protection from wind, rain, and snow, and provide insulation against cold overnight temperatures. Importantly, for the purposes of the manhunt, granite also interferes with thermal imaging technology. Thermal cameras rely on detecting temperature contrasts, and rock surfaces can absorb or disperse heat in ways that mask human signatures. A person who remains still in such a space, especially during colder periods, may be indistinguishable from the surrounding environment. This limitation is well documented in alpine search operations and would have significantly affected the ability of police and aerial units to detect Freeman from above. Beyond shelter, Freeman's movement patterns played a major role in prolonging his evasion. Accounts from community members prior to the incident indicated that he frequently walked through bush tracks and informal paths rather than relying on roads. This habit likely translated directly into his behavior during the manhunt. Individuals with bushcraft experience often employ what search specialists describe as non-patterned movement, traveling without predictable routes, avoiding repeated use of the same path, and altering timing to prevent establishing a routine. Such behavior makes it extremely difficult for ground teams to anticipate future direction or to model movement using standard search algorithms. Traveling at night is another common strategy for individuals seeking to avoid detection. In remote areas, darkness can be total, with minimal ambient light beyond moon phases. For police, safe night movement requires torches, infrared equipment, or other tools that create sound and light. A single person familiar with the terrain, by contrast, can move slowly and deliberately in near total darkness, relying on sensory cues and terrain memory. This ability provides significant operational advantages, allowing the individual to create distance while search teams focus on safety protocols that naturally slow their progress. It is also possible that Freeman utilized cached supplies, small stashes of basic items stored in the bush before the incident. People who live semi-off-grid sometimes establish hidden supply points containing food, clothing layers, fire-starting tools, or basic equipment. These caches can be concealed under rock shelves, within hollow logs, or in areas where hikers rarely pass. Even a small collection of dry food or an additional jacket could extend mobility during cold weather. While police did not publicly confirm the discovery of such caches, the possibility remains consistent with the type of lifestyle Freeman maintained for years. Another key factor in his survival was his ability to remain silent and avoid signs of recent activity. Experienced bush travelers understand how to move without leaving clear tracks, stepping on hard surfaces rather than soft soil, avoiding breaking branches, and brushing away minor disturbances. Heavy rainfall, fog, and snow, common to the alpine region, further obscure footprints or ground impressions. This combination of human practice and weather conditions reduces the likelihood of trackers identifying specific routes. In this sense, the environment worked in his favor, reinforcing his efforts to remain concealed. Psychological endurance also plays a role in long-term bush survival. Many individuals unused to isolation experience stress, disorientation, or a tendency to seek human contact. Freeman, by contrast, had lived alone for many years, maintaining minimal interaction with the community. His routines were built around solitude, and he appeared comfortable with the absence of social support. This disposition likely reduced the psychological pressures that might otherwise drive an individual out of hiding or into riskier behaviors. His familiarity with silence, isolation, and slow, deliberate movement created conditions where remaining undetected was not only possible, but aligned with his established way of life. In addition to these personal characteristics, the natural environment offered tactical advantages. The network of hidden or informal tracks allowed him to move between valleys without crossing areas commonly used by hikers or monitored by police. Watercourses may have provided natural pathways that masked sound and reduced visible footprints. Dense vegetation concealed movement even at short distances. Snow or frost could temporarily erase signs of activity. Each of these features, while challenging for search teams, formed a familiar backdrop for someone accustomed to living near the bush. The manhunt's early unpredictability also benefited the suspect, with more than 1,100 public reports creating a wide dispersion of potential sightings. Police were required to investigate multiple areas across a broad region. This fragmented focus likely reduced sustained pressure on any single part of the terrain. In such conditions, a person moving without pattern has greater opportunity to avoid areas under temporary scrutiny. While police adapted their strategies as the operation progressed, the initial spread of unverified information provided breathing room that may have allowed Freeman to establish a routine of safe movement. It is important to acknowledge that prolonged survival in bushland is demanding and carries significant risk. Cold temperatures, limited food, and unpredictable weather can quickly compromise even experienced individuals. The fact that Freeman remained unlocated suggests that he managed these risks effectively, at least for the period under examination. This does not imply he operated without difficulty. Rather, it indicates that his skills were sufficient to maintain basic needs and avoid situations that would expose him to detection. Taken together, these elements, bushcraft skills, personalized knowledge of terrain, psychological resilience, and the ability to remain silent and unpredictable, provide a clear picture of why Freeman was able to survive for so long in conditions that are challenging even for experienced search and rescue teams. His lifestyle prior to the incident had already prepared him for the demands of bush survival. The manhunt simply placed those skills in a different context. These factors also form the foundation for understanding the next phase of the investigation, the competing theories that emerged as weeks passed without confirmation of his status. Whether he received assistance, succumbed to the environment, or continued to move quietly through the bush became central questions for investigators and the public alike. The examination of these possibilities is the focus of the next section. As the manhunt progressed without a confirmed sighting, investigators were forced to confront a difficult reality. After weeks of extensive searching, no clear evidence indicated where Freeman had gone or whether he remained alive. In most major investigations, even limited physical evidence, footprints, discarded items, or a credible witness report, helps shape the direction of search strategies. In this case, the absence of such indicators led to the development of three primary theories about his disappearance. Each theory presented its own implications, shaped public perception, and revealed important limitations within the ongoing operation. The first theory, considered early in the investigation, was that Freeman had received assistance from someone outside the search zone. Assistance could take many forms: food, information about police movements, temporary shelter, or basic supplies such as clothing or equipment. It did not require a coordinated effort or a sophisticated plan. Even a brief, unintentional exchange could prolong a person's capacity to avoid detection. The Alpine region contains scattered rural properties, seasonal huts, and lightly trafficked bushland areas. any of which could offer brief refuge. Investigators examined this possibility with caution. Interviews were conducted with residents and landowners in the surrounding region, focusing on whether anyone had noticed unusual behavior, unexpected visitors, or signs of recent activity near remote structures. Police also inspected huts and sheds that are commonly used by hikers or by locals during summer months. No definitive evidence emerged to support the theory, but the absence of evidence was not conclusive. It is entirely possible for a short-term interaction to leave no clear trace. The difficulty of confirming or excluding this theory stemmed from the nature of the environment and the low population density within the broader search area. Support from another person, even if unintentional, has significant operational implications. If Freeman had been provided with food, clean clothing, or any additional resources, his ability to remain concealed would have increased substantially. Assistance could also have altered his movement patterns, allowing him to travel at times or in directions that police had not anticipated. Small acts, such as offering shelter during severe weather or providing a meal, could extend his endurance and widen the possible search radius. For investigators, the possibility of outside assistance required continuous monitoring of both the public and remote access points, which diverted time and resources from other areas of the operation. The second theory considered by police was that Freeman may have died in the bush shortly after fleeing the property, with his remains yet to be discovered. This scenario, although confronting, is consistent with other long-term searches in harsh or mountainous terrain. The Mount Buffalo region contains numerous hazards: steep drops, thick vegetation, hidden crevices, and rapidly changing weather conditions. An individual traveling alone, without proper shelter or modern navigation tools, is at significant risk of exposure, injury, or misadventure. Search teams conducted multiple targeted sweeps of areas considered high risk, including drainage lines, gullies, and terrain features that commonly trap lost hikers. Sniffer dogs were deployed during periods when weather permitted scent tracking, and helicopters conducted repeated passes over likely shelter points. However, thick vegetation, uneven ground, and the complexity of the landscape made comprehensive coverage impossible. Even in well-documented search efforts, it is not unusual for remains to go undiscovered for extended periods, particularly in alpine bushland. One factor that complicated this theory was the lack of any secondary indicators. Typically, if a person succumbs to environmental conditions, search teams may find clothing, equipment, or disturbed vegetation within a relatively limited area. In this case, no such signs were identified. The possibility remains that Freeman traveled into an area that has not yet been inspected thoroughly, or that environmental conditions erased or concealed evidence. This theory carries broader operational implications. If Freeman had died very early in the search, the extensive deployment of resources in the weeks and months that followed would still have been necessary, as investigators could not presume an outcome without confirmation. However, this scenario raised public questions about the geographical limits of the search effort and the inherent difficulty of locating a single individual in a vast and challenging environment. The third theory, and the one that many considered the most unsettling, was that Freeman remained alive and continued to move deeper into remote parts of the alpine region. This theory rested on several observed factors: his bushcraft skills, his long-term familiarity with the area, his capacity for psychological endurance, and the absence of clear signs pointing to an alternative conclusion. Movement through the bush without leaving predictable tracks is possible for individuals with the necessary experience. The environment provides multiple natural shelters, water sources, and escape routes, especially for someone willing to travel slowly and deliberately. If Freeman remained alive, his most effective strategy would have been to avoid establishing patterns. Non-patterned movement, changing direction frequently, avoiding known tracks, and traveling at irregular intervals would significantly reduce the likelihood of detection. This behavior, combined with the natural limitations imposed on search teams, could sustain long-term evasion. The environment itself also provided a degree of protection. Granite formations, dense tree cover, and changing weather conditions limited the capability of thermal imaging and aerial surveillance. Police acknowledged these constraints in public statements, noting that the environment reduced the effectiveness of tools that would otherwise contribute significantly to locating a suspect. The psychological component of survival also supports this theory. Freeman had lived with minimal human contact for many years, making extended solitude less taxing for him than for individuals unfamiliar with isolation. His daily routines prior to the incident, walking long distances, spending extended periods in the bush, and living without reliance on technology, aligned closely with the skills and mindset required for long-term concealment. In this sense, he was not adapting to a new lifestyle, but continuing the one he had already chosen. These three theories, external assistance, death in the bush, or continued survival, each posed distinct challenges for investigators. None could be confirmed or dismissed outright, and each influenced operational planning in different ways. The possibility of assistance required monitoring public behavior and conducting repeated interviews. The possibility of death required targeted searches of hazardous areas, even when conditions were difficult. The possibility of continued survival required expanding the search radius, adjusting strategies, and repeatedly reassessing terrain models. For the public, the coexistence of these theories created a narrative of uncertainty that shaped perceptions of the manhunt. Each theory carried implications that were uncomfortable in different ways. External assistance raised concerns about the ability of police to monitor communication and community behavior. Death in the bush raised questions about the limits of search capability. Survival and continued evasion raised the most confronting question of all. How could a single individual remain ahead of a multi-agency search effort for so long? For investigators, the challenge was not merely operational, but strategic. Without conclusive evidence, they were required to plan for all three possibilities simultaneously, distributing resources in ways that maintained flexibility while avoiding overcommitment to any single scenario. This balancing act extended the complexity of the operation, creating an investigative landscape defined by partial information and shifting priorities. These unresolved possibilities set the stage for the next phase of inquiry: how public perception, media framing, and operational fatigue combined to create the view that the manhunt had failed, despite the scale of the effort and the unique challenges involved. This question lies at the heart of the next section. As weeks turned into months with no confirmed sighting of Freeman, public perception of the manhunt shifted significantly. What began as a large-scale, coordinated response to a critical incident gradually came to be seen by many as an operation struggling to achieve its primary objective. The sheer scale of the search effort raised expectations that progress would be both visible and measurable. When that did not occur, questions emerged about the effectiveness of the operation and the systems supporting it. The first factor driving this perception was the length of time the suspect remained unlocated. 3 months passed without police being able to identify where Freeman had gone or whether he remained alive. In an era where law enforcement agencies often rely on digital data, surveillance networks, and rapid information exchange, the idea that a single individual could evade capture for such an extended period seemed, to many observers, at odds with modern policing capability. For the public, the comparison was simple. Despite hundreds of officers, specialist units, aerial assets, and advanced technology, there was still no outcome. The introduction of the $1 million Australian dollar reward further shaped public expectations. Rewards of this size are rare in Victoria and typically used only when authorities believe community assistance may provide a breakthrough. The announcement signaled that investigators were prepared to consider any credible information, yet no report led directly to a confirmed lead. The absence of progress despite a record-setting reward reinforced the impression that the operation was at a standstill. For critics, the reward became symbolic, representing what they viewed as a widening gap between resourcing and results. Public confidence was also affected by the broader context of the incident. The deaths of 2 police officers and the serious injury of a third had already left communities in the Alpine region deeply unsettled. The idea that the suspect remained somewhere within or beyond the surrounding bush created ongoing uncertainty. Residents complied with road checkpoints, avoided certain recreational areas, and followed safety advice issued by authorities. As time passed without a resolution, some began to question whether the police held sufficient control over the situation to ensure community safety. This erosion of confidence was reflected in public commentary and discussions on social platforms. Although many expressed sympathy for the challenges faced by police in such difficult terrain, others struggled to reconcile the scale of the manhunt with the absence of a conclusive result. Questions arose about whether search areas were too fragmented, whether coordination between agencies could have been tighter, or whether early opportunities for containment had been missed. Some of these concerns were based on incomplete information, as police did not disclose operational specifics that could compromise the search. Nonetheless, perceptions formed quickly, especially in the absence of visible progress. Media coverage further shaped the narrative. Journalists, reporting on the expanding scale of the manhunt, often used phrases that captured the sense of uncertainty surrounding the case. Descriptions such as "vanished without a trace" and "embarrassing hunt" appeared in headlines and commentary, emphasizing both the mystery of the disappearance and the perceived mismatch between effort and outcome. While such language is not uncommon in high-profile investigations, it contributed to the framing of the operation as one struggling against insurmountable odds. It is important to note that much of this commentary did not account for the unique environmental and operational challenges faced by police. The terrain, weather, and lack of digital traces severely limited investigative avenues. Officers were required to navigate hazardous ground, extreme temperatures, and unpredictable weather systems while adhering to strict safety protocols. Aerial units faced restricted flight windows, and ground teams often had to prioritize caution over speed. These factors, while unavoidable, were not always visible to the public. Nevertheless, the cumulative effect of extended uncertainty, public speculation, and critical media framing led many to conclude that the manhunt was failing. For some, the idea that a single individual could effectively withstand sustained pressure from multiple policing agencies indicated what they viewed as systemic weaknesses in the capacity to manage remote area operations. For others, the frustration stemmed not from blame, but from the emotional toll of a case tied to the deaths of officers whose families and colleagues were awaiting answers. The perception of failure was not confined to commentary. It had operational implications as well. Police were required to manage public expectations while maintaining the integrity of the search. Press conferences became forums for balancing transparency with the need to protect sensitive information. Investigators emphasized the complexity of the environment and the commitment of the personnel involved. Yet these explanations did little to ease the broader concern that the operation was unable to produce a definitive outcome. At the center of the public's doubt sat a simple, unresolved question. How could a suspect known to police, last seen at a specific rural property, and subject to a search involving hundreds of personnel, remain unlocated for months? This question, repeated across media outlets and community discussions, became the cornerstone of the notion that the operation had faltered. Even those sympathetic to the difficulties faced by search teams acknowledged that the prolonged absence of results was unusual. In examining why the manhunt came to be seen as a failure, it is necessary to recognize the distinction between perception and operational reality. Police were navigating one of the most complex environments in the state, confronting both physical and informational barriers. Yet public understanding was shaped largely by visible outcomes, or the lack thereof. This divergence between what was happening on the ground and what was visible externally contributed significantly to the narrative of failure. Ultimately, the perception that the manhunt had been unsuccessful reflected more than the absence of a result. It reflected the tension between community expectation and the inherent unpredictability of remote area searches. It is within this tension that the final questions of the investigation emerged. Questions about risk, preparedness, and the capacity of policing systems to manage cases where the terrain offers a suspect more protection than any structure or plan can easily overcome. These considerations lead directly into the concluding section of the narrative, which explores the broader lessons drawn from the operation and the unresolved questions that continue to shape public discussion of the case. The search for Freeman and the months of uncertainty that followed exposed several broader lessons about the limitations and demands of policing in remote and alpine environments. While the operational focus remained on locating the suspect, the experience highlighted systemic considerations that extend beyond a single case. These lessons do not assign blame. Instead, they reflect the practical realities of an incident shaped by terrain, timing, and the unique characteristics of the individual involved. One of the clearest lessons relates to the role of technology in modern investigations. Tools such as thermal imaging, drones, and aerial surveillance are valuable assets, and in many environments, they provide essential operational advantages. However, the Mount Buffalo region demonstrated that technology cannot overcome all environmental obstacles. Dense canopy, granite formations, shifting weather systems, and irregular terrain limited the effectiveness of equipment that might otherwise provide clear guidance. This does not diminish the importance of such tools, but it underscores the need to balance technological reliance with a deeper understanding of the conditions in which that technology is deployed. Another key lesson concerns the development of tactical strategies specifically designed for remote and mountainous terrain. Traditional search structures, which function effectively in urban or open areas, are not always suited to complex bushland. The Manhunt revealed the need for enhanced training in remote area navigation, extended deployments, and search techniques that account for irregular movement patterns. Integrating local knowledge, whether from park rangers, experienced bushwalkers, or community members familiar with the landscape, may also help refine early search parameters. A more tailored approach could support faster containment and more targeted deployment of resources in similar cases. The operation also highlighted the importance of planning for suspects who possess high levels of self-sufficiency and bush survival skills. While such individuals are uncommon, their presence introduces variables that differ significantly from those expected in urban policing scenarios. Preparing for these scenarios requires not only tactical adjustments, but also an understanding of behavioral patterns associated with extreme independence and anti-authoritarian beliefs. Early recognition of these traits may help shape risk assessments and operational responses in ways that reduce the likelihood of escalation or prolonged evasion. Community engagement remains another critical consideration. The volume of public reports, in this case, reflected both deep concern and a strong desire to assist. Yet the difficulty of managing more than 1,000 pieces of information demonstrated the need for systems capable of filtering and prioritizing large, unstructured datasets. Future operations may benefit from clearer guidance to the public on the types of information most useful to investigators, as well as more robust triage frameworks to manage high-volume reporting. Despite these lessons, the central uncertainty of the case remains unresolved. Without definitive evidence of Freeman's fate, the investigation sits in an unusual space between operational closure and ongoing possibility. Theories about his status, whether he received assistance, succumbed to the environment, or continued to move quietly through the bush, each carry implications that cannot be fully addressed in the absence of confirmation. This ambiguity has become part of the public's understanding of the case, shaping how the manhunt is discussed and remembered. In the broader context of policing, the search illustrated how even extensive resources can be constrained by environmental and behavioral factors. It also highlighted the emotional toll such operations place on officers, families, and communities. The deaths of 2 officers and the injury of a third remain at the heart of this case, grounding every operational decision in a sense of responsibility and loss. The ongoing uncertainty regarding the suspect's fate means that closure, in the traditional sense, has not been achieved. As the discussion about the case continues, one question persists, a question that carries both practical and symbolic significance for investigators, the community, and the broader public. Is Freeman still alive somewhere in the bushland, or did the story end quietly, without anyone there to witness it? It is a question without an answer, and one that may remain unresolved unless new information emerges. Yet its presence reflects the complexity of the case and the limits of certainty in environments where nature, circumstance, and individual capability intersect.